I would like to reiterate that China has always believed that dialogue and negotiations are the only viable way to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. There are no winners in trade wars, and coercion and pressure will not solve the problem either.
While the media obsesses over political drama, a silent economic earthquake just hit the US, and it's barely being talked about. US exports to China have collapsed by a staggering 94% in key sectors, triggering panic in Washington and opportunity in Beijing. This isn't just a trade imbalance, it's a geopolitical power shift. From soybeans to semiconductors, American shipments are being wiped out, while Chinese ports are suddenly filling up, not with US goods, but with replacements sourced from allies like Brazil, Russia, and even Iran. And the real kicker? China isn't losing sleep, it's capitalizing. In fact, while America scrambles to understand what went wrong, China's exports to Asia, Africa, and Latin America are exploding. This isn't just bad news for US exporters. It's a signal that America's dominance in global trade is no longer guaranteed, and Wall Street knows it. Analysts from JP Morgan and HSBC have issued back-to-back warnings. If this downward export trend continues into Q4, it could spark a ripple effect through the stock market, global supply chains, and even the 2025 presidential race. Because let's be real, no administration survives an economic collapse this massive without serious political fallout. The collapse didn't come out of nowhere. It followed a string of tit-for-tat tariffs, a breakdown in diplomatic trade talks, and now, a chilling silence from Beijing. American farmers, tech giants, and even arms manufacturers are all reporting vanishing orders. But the most shocking part? US exports of high-tech components to China, like AI chips, rare earth materials, and aerospace parts, have dropped from $3.5 billion to under $200 million in just 2 months. That's not a typo. And as China turns to domestic suppliers and alternative partners, American firms are getting locked out of one of the biggest consumer markets on the planet. It's no longer just a trade war. It's a full-blown economic decoupling. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. China isn't just replacing US goods, it's replacing US influence. Through massive infrastructure deals, currency swaps, and tech agreements under the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is positioning itself as the new go-to supplier for emerging economies. And if this trend continues, the damage to the US won't just be economic, it will be strategic. Because the less reliant countries become on US exports, the less power America has on the world stage. And that's the part no one is saying out loud. But we will, right now. Let's dig deeper. This 94% crash wasn't just economic turbulence, it was precision. Behind closed doors, Beijing has been quietly planning for this exact moment for years. Ever since the US began ramping up export controls on advanced tech, especially AI chips, aerospace parts, and critical semiconductors, China knew retaliation wasn't going to come with missiles or media blasts. It would come through strategic decoupling, in silence. And that's exactly what's happening now. Chinese importers, many state-backed, have systematically canceled contracts with American firms. But they didn't stop buying. They shifted sources. Brazil now supplies more soybeans to China than the US ever did. Germany is stepping up in automotive parts. And Russia, yes, sanctioned Russia, is backfilling oil and natural gas contracts once held by American suppliers. What's more disturbing is how China has quietly weaponized its own currency and trade networks to insulate itself. The digital yuan is now being tested in cross-border payments with the UAE, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Why does that matter? Because if more countries follow suit, US exports don't just fall, they become irrelevant in a global system that no longer needs American currency or goods. That's the nightmare scenario for Washington, and it's already underway. Meanwhile, the Biden administration, and even Trump-era economists, have failed to present a counter-strategy that sticks. Multiple Revive American manufacturing programs have been launched with fanfare, but they're stuck in bureaucracy and red tape. The CHIPS Act? Still facing delays in domestic plant construction? The Inflation Reduction Act? Failing to attract foreign buyers for U.S. green tech. So while the U.S. tries to fix internal pipelines, China's trade war response is already globalized, digitized, and monetized. And now, the real fear is contagion. With export drops already hitting over 90% in tech and agriculture, early data shows new slumps in arms, medical devices, and even pharmaceuticals. The ripple effect could gut entire industries, and it won't stop at the factories. It hits truck drivers, warehouse workers, and port authorities. And once those jobs disappear, no stimulus check is going to bring back that demand from China. That market is gone, possibly forever. We'll show you the exact sectors next, including who's getting hit hardest and which U.S. state economies are on the verge of collapse. Spoiler: it's not who you think. You'd expect California or New York to feel the heat first, but that's not what's happening. The first signs of collapse are showing up in states you'd never expect: Iowa, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Texas. Why? Because these are export-reliant economies. In Iowa, over 60% of soy and corn exports were going directly to China, until they weren't. Now thousands of grain silos sit full. Farmers are defaulting on equipment loans, and rural banks are raising red flags. In South Carolina, aerospace parts and auto components were a booming export sector, mostly feeding China's rapid industrial expansion. Now, Boeing subcontractors are laying off workers. Freight routes to the port of Charleston are down 38%, and in Louisiana, liquefied natural gas exports, once the shining gem of American energy diplomacy, have tanked. Barges are stranded, terminal workers are on reduced hours, and state tax revenues are already showing a sharp dip. And then there's Texas. Everyone sees Texas as oil country, which it is. But it's also home to a rapidly growing semiconductor and machinery export sector. Those chips were destined for Asia. And now, with China pulling out and Taiwan reducing orders under pressure, Texas is facing a manufacturing freeze. Plants that were just completed 6 months ago are now running at 20% capacity. Workers are still showing up. But for how long? This isn't just a trade issue, it's a political crisis in the making. Governors in these states are starting to clash with federal trade officials, demanding emergency funding, calling for new trade missions, and some even accusing the White House of losing the China strategy war. One unnamed official in Texas told The Hill, "We built an entire export infrastructure for a buyer that doesn't want our goods anymore." And it gets worse. These economic shocks are starting to hit real estate, logistics, and even school budgets, because export taxes fund a lot more than just ports. When revenue dries up, public services shrink. That's already happening in rural Iowa and southern Louisiana, where school districts are discussing teacher layoffs and early closures for the first time since 2008. And yet, there's almost zero national coverage on this. Why? Because the drop was so sudden and the ripple effects so scattered, it doesn't look like a crash. But zoom out, and you'll see a slow-motion detonation across export-dependent America, and China hasn't even played its final card yet. Coming up, we'll break down the industries that China is now flooding with its own products, filling the gap left by U.S. exports, and how this is setting up a permanent power shift in global trade. As U.S. exports vanish from Asia, China isn't just stepping in, it's flooding the zone. The very industries where America was dominant just months ago, China now dominates with frightening speed. Soybeans? China has tripled purchases from Brazil and begun subsidizing domestic production. Semiconductors? It's fast-tracking a $47 billion chip independence plan, even using American blueprints acquired years ago. Machinery? Chinese firms are offering 30% cheaper alternatives, with zero tariffs, to countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. What this means is simple. China is replacing US goods with its own. In markets, the US spent decades building. It's not just a pivot, it's a systemic reshuffle of global supply lines. And the biggest shock? US allies are starting to play along. Thailand just signed a massive agri-deal with Beijing. Indonesia canceled a US energy contract, replacing it with a Chinese consortium. Even Australia, once a firm US trade ally, is now pushing for expanded yuan-denominated trade zones. Meanwhile, American firms are watching from the sidelines, with unsold goods, idle factories, and rising costs. A leaked email from a top executive at a Midwestern agri-export firm read, "We lost 9 contracts in 3 weeks. China's pricing makes it impossible to compete. We're dead in the water." And Beijing isn't hiding it. At the World Trade Forum last month, Chinese state representatives laid out a clear plan. Replace dependency on US inputs. Establish dominance in Africa and Asia. Expand in Europe where dollar reliance weakens. That's not speculation. That's official policy. But the most brutal twist? Some of the goods now being exported from China were once made in the US by American companies. After years of offshoring, China kept the IP, the labor model, and the manufacturing base. Now it's using all three to undercut US exports and lock in trade deals. This isn't just about money, it's about perception of power. When country after country shifts to Chinese goods, they aren't just choosing a price point, they're choosing who they align with economically. And right now, that choice isn't favoring the US. In the next segment, we'll expose who inside the US actually profits when exports crash, and why some of America's biggest companies and lobbyists don't mind losing the trade war. Here's what no one wants to say out loud. Some US corporations are profiting from this crash. While small exporters and manufacturers are getting wiped out, the biggest multinationals, they've already moved production overseas. So when US exports tank, they simply reroute their supply chains through China, Vietnam, or Mexico, and sell back to America at higher margins. In other words, America loses, but the top 1% wins even bigger. Just look at the lobbying trail. In the last fiscal quarter alone, over $40 million was spent by export-heavy industries lobbying against new tariffs, pushing for looser trade with China, and demanding corporate tax cuts, not to revive American exports, but to make overseas outsourcing cheaper. Meanwhile, DC talks tough. But beneath the surface, both parties are quietly aligned with the very conglomerates that let this happen. You think this was an accident? The deindustrialization of America has been engineered for decades, and now we're watching the final phase. First, the factories disappeared, then the exports. Now, the global power that came with them. And while American ports sit idle, Chinese ships are loaded to capacity. Their trade deals are expanding weekly. Their tech, energy, and food exports are backed by state funding. And their message to the world? We're the new engine of global trade, and the US can't catch up. So where does that leave the US? Scrambling to revive domestic manufacturing, but without the infrastructure, losing allies in the trade war, and watching the dollar's leverage shrink with every new China-led deal. The real danger? If this trend continues, America won't just lose export markets. It could lose its global influence entirely. The crash of goods is only the first wave. Next comes the crash of trust, leverage, and control. If this shift shocks you, it should, but this is just the surface. In our next report, we'll break down how US allies are turning toward China and the secret trade pacts being signed in the shadows. So hit subscribe, stay informed, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Because this isn't just economics, it's the new global war for control.